Hello and welcome back to APUS History, Era 6. In this video, we will be looking at Topic 6.3, which along with Topic 6.2, which we did previously, looks at the causes and effects of westward expansion in the latter half of the 19th century. This one specifically looks at social and cultural development, whereas the last one had focused on economic development. As I said before, know that they are very interrelated and even address the same key objective question. So let's get started. Of course, we've already looked at the economics of the homesteaders who flooded the Great Plains looking for opportunities the free land offered. They hoped to achieve self-sufficiency and independence, to work for themselves and support their families. Only about 20% of those who settled the area, though, were actually taking advantage of the Homestead Act. The rest were purchasing land outright, often from railroad companies who had received it as part of their land grants to build the railroads in the first place. After all, these plains farmers were going to need a way to transport their goods to market, and the closer they were to an established rail line, the better. The situation was essentially the same with miners and ranchers, whose images helped to create a romanticized image of the American West. And of course, as those trains stopped to replenish fuel and water for steam power, towns would pop up, just as they did if ore was discovered in a particular region. Some of these boom towns lasted only briefly, whereas others grew into major cities in their own right, supporting the nearby rural areas, but also developing manufacturing, banking, and various commercial enterprises. The West was growing so rapidly that the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier to be closed as of 1890. And this was a significant moment. Noted historian Frederick Jackson Turner had written a significant paper called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, published in 1893. In it, he argued that the closing of the frontier was not really a cause for celebration, but rather a cause for concern. And the reason was that the frontier had always served as a kind of safety valve of sorts for American discontent. He said that the existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward was the central story of American history. It had also continually renewed American ideas of democracy and individualism, and had therefore shaped not just the West, but the nation as a whole. Without this frontier, the nation would be forced to undergo a painful transition from a perception of America as a land of endless opportunity to one that had America beginning to look a whole lot like Europe, particularly with its class struggles and poverty. Of course, though, the land that these frontier settlers were moving into wasn't empty. It had thriving communities of native peoples. But no one seemed to particularly care what hardships they would face with white settlers flooding their lands. The federal government did try to address the issue by creating a reservation system, with native people assigned to specific tracts of land with strict boundaries. Plains, many native tribes had developed largely mobile lifestyles since the introduction of the horse, and they followed the vast herds of bison and completely depended on them for all of their resources. Living on a reservation wouldn't allow them to continue this. Also, with the influx of people from the eastern U.S., the buffalo population had been decimated. Railroad workers and train passengers killed the animals indiscriminately, sometimes for food, but mostly for sport. The buffalo were also essentially labeled as vermin because of their competition with cattle for grass. Buffalo robes became fashionable in the East, so profit seekers slaughtered thousands of bison simply for their hides. The remains were left for the local vultures. The army was even known to use Gatling guns on the herds to reduce their numbers. And these various plans proved to be effective. At the end of the Civil War, it was estimated that some 15 million buffalo roamed the Great Plains, already down significantly from the 60 million that may have existed before European contact. But by 1900, there was actually only several hundred animals left. The species was nearly extinct. As the numbers of white settlers from the East increased dramatically, conflicts with native tribes did so as well. Despite numerous treaties, the demand for native lands meant that the U.S. government would void old treaties in order to make new ones favorable to white Americans, much more so than they would be favorable to the natives. Native Americans were growing increasingly intolerant of being pushed onto less desirable territory. Sand Creek was a village of approximately 800 Cheyenne Indians in southeastern Colorado. Despite the territory having been promised to the Cheyenne by an 1851 treaty, in November of 1864, a group called the Colorado Volunteers, led by Colonel John Chivington, surrounded Sand Creek, attacking and killing about 400 people, most of whom were women and children. And the brutality of this Chivington Massacre, or Sand Creek Massacre, was extreme. Some of the Cheyenne were shot while trying to escape. Others were shot pleading for mercy. Reports also indicated that the troops even emptied their rifles on distant infants for sport. Later, Chivington would display his personal scalp collection to the public as a badge of pride. When word spread to other Indian communities, it was agreed that these white settlers must be met with force. Most instrumental in the retaliation were Sioux warriors under the leadership of Red Cloud. In 1866, Sioux warriors ambushed troops that were trying to complete the construction of the Bozeman Trail in Montana. Fetterman's 81 soldiers and settlers, there was not a single survivor. Faced with a stalemate, Red Cloud and the U.S. agreed to the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which brought a temporary end to hostilities. Government promised large tracts of land and identified those as belonging to the Sioux and Cheyenne as their territory. But this would also be short-lived. In 1874, a scientific exploration group led by General George Armstrong Custer discovered gold in the heart of the Black Hills of South Dakota, in Sioux territory. When word of the discovery leaked, nothing could stop the masses of prospectors looking to get rich quick, despite the treaty that had awarded this land to the Sioux. Chiefs Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, the local Indian leaders, decided to take up arms to defend their dwindling land supply. Custer's orders were to locate the Sioux encampment in the Bighorn Mountains of Montana and trap them until reinforcements could arrive. On June 25, 1876, he did discover what he thought was a small Indian village on the banks of the Little Bighorn River. But rather than waiting for reinforcements, Custer confidently ordered his troops to attack, not realizing that he was not attacking a small settlement. He was actually confronting the main Sioux and Cheyenne encampment. About 3,000 Sioux warriors, led by Chief Crazy Horse, descended upon his regiment, and within hours the entire 7th Cavalry, including General Custer, were massacred. This was a brief victory, though, for the Sioux. The rest of the United States regulars arrived and pursued the Sioux for the next several months. By October of that year, much of the resistance had ended. Crazy Horse had surrendered, though Sitting Bull and a small band of his warriors had escaped into Canada. The crackdown on Native Americans, though, did not end with the pursuance of Custer's attackers. Any tribes resisting American advancements were relentlessly hunted by settlers and federal troops. The year after Custer's infamous defeat, in 1877, the Nez Perce Indians, whose traditional homelands were along the border of Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, would fall victim to this western expansion. When gold was discovered on their lands that year, demands were made for over 90% of their land, forcing them onto a smaller reservation. After a standoff between tribal warriors and the U.S. Army, their leader, known as Chief Joseph, directed his followers towards Canada to avoid capture. He hoped to join forces with Sitting Bull and planned the next move from there. Army officials pursued the Nez Perce for almost 1,300 miles across Idaho and western Montana. As the border with Canada, they paused to rest, having traveled that whole distance in just over 3 months as winter was settling in. But the U.S. Army was able to close in because they had advanced warning of where they were headed, thanks to the telegraph. Surrounded, and Chief Joseph was forced to surrender. The entire tribe would be located to Kansas and Oklahoma, where nearly half of them would perish from disease and despair. Their stock, in particular the herds of horses that they had come to rely on and that had made their near escape possible in the first place, were mostly slaughtered. Meaning native peoples, particularly the Sioux and many other tribal groups, were forced onto reservations, essentially at gunpoint. But those reservations, too, were constantly under attack. Congress passed several laws, such as the Indian Appropriation Act in 1871, which officially ended federal recognition of the sovereignty of Indian nations, and nullified all previous treaties made with them, forcing the tribes to make new treaties, all of which benefited the U.S. government more than it did any tribe. Then came the Dawes Act of 1887. Under this law, the federal government officially abandoned the reservation system and divided reservation lands into 160-acre plots to be farmed by Indian families. The remainder of land previously part of reservations would be taken back by the U.S. government and made available to settlers, often in great land rushes. Much of Oklahoma was settled in these large-scale land rushes, which were literally a race to stake a claim of former Indian land. The Dawes Act also did allow Native Americans to gain U.S. citizenship, only on the condition, though, that they settled on their allotted land and assimilated fully into American culture. Also remember that 160 acres of land, which is the same amount that was granted under the Homestead Act, isn't actually enough to support a family on the plains. This assimilationist movement, as it came to be called, was an attempt to put an end to distinct Indian cultures through forced education, vocational training, and Christianization, often taking native children and forcing them into special boarding schools away from their tribes and families. Despite these attempts to destroy native culture, many tribes tried to preserve as much of their culture as possible. They may have officially been prevented from speaking native languages in public or wearing traditional dress, but many did so in secret. And there was also a kind of religious awakening that began to develop among some of the tribes. Though instead of bringing an answer to their prayers, this movement resulted in yet another human travesty. The native peoples believed that an Indian Messiah would come and the world would become free of the white man. The native peoples would be able to return to their lands, and the buffalo would once again roam the Great Plains. Followers of this belief meditated, reported visions, and performed what came to be known as the ghost dance. Before long, it had followers in tribes throughout the West. Although this ghost dance movement preached nonviolence, whites feared that the movement would spark native rebellions. They felt that the ghost dance followers were more defiant than other natives, which was disconcerting to both soldiers and settlers throughout the West. When the ghost dance movement reached the Lakota Sioux, residents of South Dakota demanded that the Sioux stop performing this ritual. When those requests were ignored, the U.S. Army was called in for assistance. Fearing aggression, a group of 300 Sioux left their reservation. Army regulars believed them to be a hostile force preparing for attack. When the two sides came into contact, this group of Sioux reluctantly agreed to be transported to the Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Morning of December 29, 1890, as they were preparing to do so, the Army demanded the surrender of all Sioux weapons, and amid the tension, a shot rang out. So the Army opened fire on the Sioux. Some were shot in their tents, others were cut down as they tried to run away. And when the smoke cleared, almost all of the 300 women, men, and children were dead, some dying instantly, others being left to freeze to death in the snow. This massacre marking the final showdown between Native Americans and the U.S. Army. About what you need to know about topic 6.3, social and cultural development of the Great West. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.